today, joined by Shauheen Etminan from Ancestral Magi and VCENNA. How do we want to say that? VCENNA?
VCENNA. That was right.
VCENNA.
Thanks.
Yeah. Cool. Well, I'm excited to have you on. And folks should know that we got a chance to meet way back at Wonderland a bunch of years ago, and very curious about what you've been up to. And I do watch somewhat carefully, and I'm always fascinated. So you have a Ph.D. in plant extracts, is that right? Or I'm sure there's a more technical term.
Yeah, it's in chemical engineering mass transfer that's been used, very actively in plant extraction.
That's awesome. Oh man, and I see here that you got to do some Singularity University time, which is really cool. That's quite the interesting incubator. How long did you spend there?
3 months in Ames, NASA Research Park.
That's gotta feel fun, and kind of apt. So I guess first let's kind of dig into like when did psychedelics sort of come on your radar, and then like when did these kind of traditional I don't know if we want to say plants of the Magi's or like kind of Persian plants come on your radar?
Absolutely. First of all, Joe, thanks so much for having me on Psychedelic Today's podcast, and hello to your listeners. I think the story begins from kind of like late 2019. At that point, I was working on a technology for extraction of cannabis very effectively and high yield, and the psychedelic space kind of started to open up a lot of promises and hopes around. And I live in Vancouver, which is kind of like the front line of psychedelic use and also growth, specifically with mushrooms. So that was a time that I did a lot of experimentation with extraction of alkaloids from different mushrooms. But the story of like how I got to kind of like look into the Iranian heritage for presence of psychoactive compounds actually comes from a day that I was running in North Shore here in Vancouver, and I stopped by a store that is kind of like selling different type of spiritual pieces. I was trying to buy a piece of kind of like sage and for my place, and they had this kind of like side corner used books that I never buy. Actually, I never buy used books. I was always, I'm a kind of like buy my books from Amazon. I keep on Amazon Kindle, and very serendipitously, I found this book that is written by a Romanian religion studies prof that's been actually, interestingly, he was murdered in the University of Chicago. And he has reviewed different plant traditions around the world, which was one of them. It's actually a very small sector about Iran and the use of psychedelics in Iran by shamanic indigenous people and their practices, before Zarathustra. This is about we're talking about like 4,000 years or 2,000 years BC. And interestingly, the trace of that came into like me finding one book after the other. And there is a book written by two authors from 1989. It's called Haoma and Harmaline. That's been written by David Flattery and Martin Schwartz. Martin Schwartz is actually a Avestan language, which is old Iranian language linguist, and the University of Berkeley prof. And interestingly, they had this book is available online, and they kind of like go very deeply into the studies of these traditions and plants. And this potion called Homa from that context, that was kind of like how it opened up everything for me to look into this plant that we actually still use called espand, or we know it as Syrian Ru. So that is kind of like where the whole story began.
That's interesting. And I have these images in my head of, opium smoking and music and kind of like ancient Persian culture for quite a while was like the peak of civilization in the world, right? Like recreational mathematics being displayed at the court, and um, all sorts of really interesting, displays of civilization. Generally, if we look at architecture today in Iran, it's unbelievable. Some of the religious and kind of, I guess, post-royal architecture. So definitely an interesting place that had a lot of really interesting things happening for quite a
Yeah.
while.
Well, it's interesting. I think one of the very interesting points about Iran that I also explored later on is the number of religions that have been created in Iran. And that's also, a way for like when you, especially when being in a psychedelic space, is always about like somebody having a revelation and then sharing with people around and then kind of like taking it further. And that's also fascinating. Islam was kind of like imported to Iran from later on, but even within Iran, the number of religions, the small religions that have been around, is very fascinating.
Mm, that's fascinating. So, like you mentioned Zarathustra earlier, and like the Zoroaster kind of figure. I I know Nietzsche was a sort of philologist, and I wonder if he was just able to like kind of dig deep and found like a really interesting, clever name there. I saw your posts recently on Nietzsche's birthday, and I really appreciated that because there's, yeah, like European civilization didn't really hit those kinds of heights. I guess it like in the same way, like from baseline culture to peak. Like baseline culture globally, it's everybody's still kind of like goat herders, and then you have this like gigantic civilization at the center of it. Europe kind of just had like a few hundred years of something, and Nietzsche kind of pulling on the past in a really with a really powerful figure there. Like, did you personally like dig into that a little bit and find any kind of clever overlap?
Well, I think the interestingly, what I see when we distill everything to let's say what is the gist of like commonality between what was processed, let's say, as the uh, maybe kind of like a backgrounds of what makes a civilization to grow and to enroll, let's say, kind of wider range of people into a type of a narrative that's a like all serving narrative. I think with that, what I see specifically with the Zoroastrian teachings, not necessarily a religion, because religion is like a very kind of institutional narrative of what was really the teachings of that Zarathustra, which is kind of like a baseline of what Nietzsche also looked into through his book. Um, I think if you distill that down, is all about how you understand morality and how you kind of implement that into like the definition of goodness, like as a compass. This is very difficult because it's so subjective and it can be interpreted from like every angle. Even being righteous or righteousness, like it's anybody like can feel that they're right, but goodness is something that I think is common. It's something that like it's really coming from within. It's not a narrative. It's subjective, but at the same time it's kind of it relates to some level of subconscious too, that your subconscious has to be in peace with that, otherwise you're not in whole alignment. And I think
Mm-hmm.
with this narrative, and then how you can shape this for an understanding of, let's say, people at that age, with Zarathustra, and later on, let's say in Europe with Nietzsche. This is the interesting part. Like when you read Thus Spoke Zarathustra, some of them you feel that it's like there are so many stories, and just finding what is that gist of a story and how it's really contributing this to the whole uh, presentation of the wisdom that he tries to lay out through the book is simple, but at the same time it's difficult, like for reading sometimes. So this is to me, it's like this whole notion of looking into the past 5,000 years and then see what you can really learn and bring forward. I guess like maybe with the book, with the Sapiens, when it comes out, came out as a, just like maybe a quick look into, let's say, past 7,000, 5,000 years. Like this is very helpful to look into some of these highlights in terms of what can kind of, what has led human to do better and where kind of like it fell apart. And I think the psychedelics definitely with the study of what I understand from today, from kind of like where Zarathustra's baseline of his thoughts or mindset comes from, it's fascinating to see how neuroscience is involved into that, how basically how kind of like even presentation of an idea, like the way that you're presenting it, and then you're enrolling other believers into that is playing a role.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's interesting. So, this idea of Syrian Ru, it kind of came on my radar around 2007 or so when I started reading about people doing this practice of developing their own kind of ayahuasca analogs in a sense, and like drinking it, perhaps drinking it separate or at the same time. It has a high MAOI content similar to the ayahuasca vine. I'm sure it has all sorts of other interesting chemistry that you know plenty about. But that's how it came up on my radar. And I thought that was really interesting that we didn't necessarily have to like predate on the Amazon rainforest. We could use plants from other parts of the world. And I found that fascinating. It didn't come to me that there was a tradition around it until at least 3-4 years later. So like as far as I understand, there's no like explicit tradition of using it today in like an exoteric sense. Is that somewhat accurate?
Yeah, that's correct. Well, it exists within like every Iranian's homes, as a incense, like that you burn, and then like it's kind of like, I would say 99% they have it, and it's a sacred plant, but they're not ingesting it. It's mostly they're burning it, and the reason for burning is kind of like to just to kind of like stay away from evil, or stay away from bad energies, and we have it. It's kind of like it's a ceremony around that they're a container, they put the seeds over it, and then like they put it on fire, starts to burst, like this like white smoke come out. And so this is still like exists as very it's very alive. But interestingly, which is actually is interesting for my own culture as well, like none of the Iranians, they know that this is a very heavy psychoactive compound. So this is the part that to me also came as something very interesting. But I want to step back, Joe, a little bit.
Please.
Syrian Ru is, so what we know about the psychedelic or use of psychoactive practice or shamanic practice from ancient Iran is all about a brew. It's not a brew, it's actually an elixir or a potion called Home or Homa, that the Homa or Soma, which is its Vedic sister equivalent, these are they basically, the word even means to press out. So they were mixture, they were botanical mixtures. This plant extract or Homa, we know that like the botanical identity of this admixture has been the kind of a speculation, like a matter of speculation among so many people. And the approach to that speculation in a lot of different publications is very historical, story-based or metaphorical. But the point that you look into that from a pharmacological or neuroscientific approach, this is something that's very new. And Syrian Ru, based on the research that I've done, is one of those compounds that matches with what we know from the text and what we know from the effect that's been referred in the text. So it's not necessarily only Syrian Ru. Syrian Ru was one of the compounds. There were other plants that ephedra is actually one of them, that they're still Zoroastrian, they're still using ephedra as home in their ceremonies, but it's not very intoxicating. And these are the main two plants. But this notion of an equivalent to ayahuasca is still being practiced, I think it's a very Western narrative of what ayahuasca is. That is a DMT portion and an MAOI portion, and then they're kind of looking for an equivalent of these two mechanism of actions to create the same effect. Definitely ecologically, Syrian Ru is way more available, prevalent, and also even in terms of the amount of alkaloids, it's about 5 to 10 times more alkaloids, harmful alkaloids, than B copy, which
Whoa.
is one of the compounds is a little bit different. I can get into that detail as well, but in general, like for example, I was talking to a few people from Egypt that are looking into working with acacia and Syrian Ru as an equivalent to ayahuasca, but we don't have that anywhere reported as a practice. It's mostly recreating an ayahuasca experience with two different plants rather than traditionally, let's say, traditional existence of these, these practices in the past.
Yeah, that's fascinating. So thanks for that. I would have had no idea that Syrian Ru is more powerful, with the MAOI at least. That's fascinating. And are there like secondary, tertiary molecules you're interested in Syrian Ru?
Well, in general, a big difference between Syrian Ru and B copy, which is we call it as ayahuasca wine, is that in terms of there are three main molecules that are that exist in ayahuasca brew as well as in Syrian Ru. One of them is harmine, or banistrine or telepathine. One of them is harmaline, and the other one is tetrahydroharmine. So ayahuasca is very rich in harmine and tetrahydroharmine, but Syrian Ru is rich in harmine and harmaline. And harmaline is a very different effect from tetrahydroharmine. That's why you kind of like hear about some of these experiences that, let's say, ayahuasca brew is made with, let's say, the seeds of a spand or Syrian Ru, and people have tremor over, let's say, the experience. That is mostly because of the effect of harmaline at higher doses. So the other compounds, the emerging compounds, they are mostly the other harmala compounds. They're like harmol, harmalol, harmon. There are, this is kind of like a range of about, let's say, less than 10 molecules that exist in both plants. But just if their prevalence is very little and is low, that still just being focused on these three molecules, it has a lot of rooms for discovery.
Mm-hmm. That's great. What are some other plants that you're really interested in right now that Ancestral Magi is working with?
Well, one plant that's been kind of very interesting is coming from, so one plant that's my interest is actually ephedra, which is a scheduled compound. Ephedrine comes from that plant. It's kind of like being used for a while as sport, like for supporting, let's say, sport applications. It's an equivalent to what exactly MDMA does, the same, receptor profile. The only downside of it that was kind of made it scheduled after a while was because it also binds to opiate receptors and it's kind of is addictive. But from a kind of like more anthropological perspective, that's the plant that I'm interested, but we can't use it in Ancestral Magi formulations. So we kind of have to focus on what we know. For example, saffron is now being studied as a compound that's been used for dealing with anxiety very widely. That's very interesting. There's also another plant that we are using in our Mang supplement, which is our lucid dreaming supplement, that is a Chinese herb. yeah, that has a compound called, a group of compounds called Hupersia that is helping with dream recall. Um,
Mm.
yeah. So what else? Yeah, there's Boletus idyllis mushroom. That's another mushroom that's kind of psychoactive but less known. That's another plant. Yeah, there's been a very wide group of like this first emergence of our formulations came mostly around beta carbolines. That is still like there's a lot to learn about and kind of learn from our customers too, because again, like any other psychoactive, it affects kind of like very differently on different biologies. But at the same time, yeah, just the second generation is going to combine some of these for better formulation as well as better protocols for adoption of a practice.
Mm. So, yeah, personally, I have no recollection of dreams. I'm sure I'm dreaming pretty heavily. So that's really interesting to me. For a little while, I did have a bit of like a lucid dreaming practice, and I wondered if there was a way to get that back. I think like the fact that you have so many interesting plants involved is kind of cool. By the way, I'm sure you've seen this, but I saw a Venice Beach microdosing company start including saffron recently,
Really? Hmm.
and I'm glad you brought it up. I had a question. I was like, are you just including it because it's expensive, or like, is there actual utility? It sounds like there is utility,
No, no, there's
so it's
actually
really
very
neat.
established clinical trials with saffron that shows that it has anxiolytic effect. And interesting, that was actually before my Twitter account was closed. I was following this guy that he was saying that pharma just doesn't want people to know about saffron because it does almost everything that many of the antidepressant and anxiolytic kind of compounds do in the pharmaceutical, but for saffron actually does so for in most of the cases. There's very established clinical study research done on saffron actually and available.
Hmm. Yeah, that's interesting. I love that. Um, so what like I think there's something interesting about bringing kind of traditional Iranian projects or products forward, right? Like there's not like we don't really have any kind of in America, probably Canada as well. We don't really have much of a relationship to Iran, right? It's like mostly like a bad relationship. Um, but like it's interesting though that there's such depth to the culture, and amazing history. Like what made you want to kind of bring this stuff forward?
Well, this is very interesting question. I think what we know and can't deny is that the history and legacy of mystical practices, like in Iran and in that region, like it kind of dates back to many years. So there's still those practices are around, like with current narratives and the political environment that exists. Let's say around Iran, and yeah, it could communicate like with the connection with the West or adversity that you see. These are all the narratives that comes in a political uh, level, plus the fact that this adversity is actually coming from the narrative of Islam that the Iranian government puts out and enforces to people. But when you get to people, it's very different. Like yeah, even the Islam in Iran is not Islam. I'm not sure where is the source of Islam, because in Saudi Arabia, like Jennifer Lopez is now gone on a stage, this last week, and Saudi Arabia as the exporter of Islam is now kind of like very moderate. But this narrative that exists, that enforces hijab or whatever it is, it's kind of is a very made, kind of like for specific purpose narrative. But aside from that, still like there is a deep level of mystical practices that if you, yeah, kind of like open up what a mystical practice is kind of exactly like a psychedelic experience. And like it's the connection of your conscious mind with the unconscious, like to put it that way. And there's so many different practices around in Iran that from Zoroastrianism to Sufism, to like even, let's say there are kind of like, there are like little other parcels of, different, not religions, but again, mystical practices that still is around, is underground, is kind of a little bit not on the surface. And there is lessons to be shared from these globally. And this is something that I think that's not really relevant to today's narrative of what Iran is in the political environment and climate. Is mostly something that is like, it's kind of like the gift of humanity that has to be shared, specifically with this psychedelic renaissance happening. That I think that like the biggest guidance is actually coming from the history of 3,000 years of, or 4,000 years of using these compounds, because they have done it and they have the lesson, and we don't need to just kind of like go around and do this, all the mistakes. We can use it in the, like in our advantage somehow. So that's my interest for basically bringing any practice that can make human to feel whole, as a whole being, like very connected with different layers of its being, psychologically, spiritually, intellectually, emotionally, and physically. So I think even though the story of ancestral magi comes from a legacy of use of these compounds, what we do is very global. There is no, there is this angle, like a cultural angle, that I think it has to be with it, for reverence of where it comes from, and also reflecting the true stories. Because like, if you're interested in the psychedelic space, you can just shape anything and angle it toward, the serving of the space. But that's not necessarily what happened in ancient Iran. Actually, Zarathustra, when he came out, one of his teaching was to kind of like to limit the use of psychoactive compounds. I'm actually having a talk about this at the Divinity School in Harvard this coming February, which is the lessons that comes from Zarathustra for using the intoxicants, for different applications. And I think that, these lessons are something that like goes along with today's narrative in the psychedelic renaissance.
That's super interesting. I think there's so much left to learn. This is an interesting analogy for me, because we talk a lot about holotropic breathwork here, which is informed by a lot of great mystery traditions, mystical traditions. And, I study a lot of the mystical traditions. I have since, the early 2000s, because I'm like, if these are human experiences that are on the menu, like, how do I find out which ones I want and how do I get there? Psychedelics happen to be one of the most expeditious ways, but there's so many traditions that can, give us like slow measured growth, a path with heart. And honestly, the experiences can look very similar. I think you mentioned that a few times. Like there's no reason why something you can do in a lucid dream or assorted mystical practices necessarily has to look a lot different from an ayahuasca experience. I think that's hard for a lot of people to understand in psychedelia, because it's so drugs are the ultimate thing.
Mm-hmm.
And for me, it's the human organism existing in this planet is the fundamental thing. Because without that, the ayahuasca wouldn't be able to interact with the human organism. And, similarly, mystical practices wouldn't necessarily be able to create these states without the human, unless there's some other species, but, that we don't have to do that now. But, there's just so much there. So I think it just really behooves people to look at non-psychedelic religious experiences that folks can have. There's plenty of literature on it. Transpersonal psychology covers it quite a bit. There's all sorts of ethnographies from all quarters of the globe where we can, learn about what people were doing. The Sufis are still quite active. And there's plenty of other, I can't say similar groups, but groups that can help people get mystical experiences. And I think maybe this is a hangover from Terence McKenna, who didn't really want us doing this, because it's like, why would you? But it's like, well, not everything needs to be mushrooms, Terence.
Yeah. Well, I think there is now being in the space for like a few years and being exposed to different plant traditions as well as more of, let's say, lab-made molecules from the legacy of Alex Shogun, Terence McKenna, people that kind of like shape this experience, with the LSD, or experience of understanding of psychedelics, let's say within the last 40 or 50 years. So when I'm um, kind of like distilling down to, okay, what is that we are looking for? Like, it's exactly like, again, a conscious understanding of when you are getting in touch with receiving information from the unconscious or from the subconscious. So this is literally the a psychedelic experience, if not psychedelics as a compounds, but a psychedelic experience that is an altered state of consciousness that you're exposed to, and then it's not only, let's say, something that you're exposed to, but something that you can like learn from. You can receive information, and then you can bring that to your day-to-day life, and yeah, just like use it to your advantage, like through integration, which has become a phase, it was part of the jargons of, working with psychedelics. But if we are looking into these compounds, actually, my understanding from my research, and I think this is where we should not really separate psychedelics from other modalities, because I think the understanding of psychedelics, even as a psychedelic compound in the West, is very tryptamine based notion. So anything that kind of binds to 5-HT serotonin, its receptors, and then makes you have a high kind of intensity processing of information from what you know. Let's say if we consider that this is partly an interconnectedness, let's say, of your thoughts or your neural pathways from different part of your brains, like communicating with each other when your stress level is low and you're able to really reflect on something that's happening to you. This is just one level of psychedelic experience. And I think to me, this is not, and when I'm looking actually to ancient traditions, like what we know about, like say, tryptamine is partly coming from, let's say, Amazon, with ayahuasca, and then kind of like looking into DMT, and the other part is actually coming from, let's say, Mexico with psilocybin mushrooms, or let's say some of similar region, let's say Mesoamerica, South America. But again, the narrative around DMT becoming very pronounced as a kind of like as a player in this equation is something that is the narrative of the current psychedelic renaissance. The current psychedelic renaissance plus maybe like our understanding of psychedelics from the 50 years ago. But if you look into the kind of any type of mystical practices from the ancient time, dreaming and this liminal stage, not necessarily dreaming, like this liminal stage between dreaming and wakefulness, which we know it as hypnagogia or liminal states. This has been the environment that altered state of consciousness that existed in many traditions. It was kind of like the same. I even believe that that's the same for ayahuasca. So we know ayahuasca as a psychedelic brew, that MAOI is there to potentiate your DMT. But me just going to Amazon and participating with Santo Daime Church in making ayahuasca, and then the intensity of and the relation with the bark of the plant, like the Banistropsis copy bark, and how much that effect, let's say, when you're hammering that, extracting that, versus, let's say, the leaves of chacruna, which has DMT. Like, you see that there is so much going on around the bark. And there are narratives that the ayahuasca was the ayahuasca wine for a long time, and there was many other additives, including one of these additives that was added to the as admixture was DMT. And then if you, let's say, sit with other groups, they are adding other additives too. It's not only an MAOI and DMT. So looking into the same thing to Iran or even Egypt recently, there has always been this denominator of a state that you're kind of going into this liminal state between falling asleep and wakefulness. And then you can potentiate that experience with a psychedelic experience. So like kind of like redefining what ayahuasca is. So the reason that ayahuasca is very spiritual for everyone versus a DMT pen is mostly because of that hypnagogic state that you're experiencing. And like the whole story now has become reversed. Like people are just so fascinated about DMT, which is, I guess the DMT experience to me is more of like a yeah, just like a overstimulation. Overstimulation. There's a lot of things that are happening to you at the same time, and then it's very overwhelming for anybody to go through this experience. Versus if you look into only that hypnagogia, that's the realm of like being present, very aware and patient for the doors to open to you, and then for you to receive information from the unconscious or from your subconscious. I think that's also the difference between what we do with Magi products versus something that is more stimulating. Let's say you take it and then you have this flush of thoughts that is stimulating. That's something psychoactive that people feel it very easily and kind of serve that immediacy that exists in today's life, that people are not really like patient with anything. But at the same time, it needs integration. It needs the next day care. There's just so much that comes with, and not necessarily all these experimentation or let's say use of the compounds, even for therapeutic use, always serve to healing or serve to betterment of that person. Versus the more traditional use was around this opening up, and the process-wise is actually very correct too. Like this is the state that every night you experience. Like with full dreaming, the issue is that like your conscious get disconnected from your process on the other side. But if you can make this an open highway in a way that you consciously pass over to this liminal state, like basically pass, either stay at the liminal state between the two realms of consciousness and unconsciousness, or even like be able to wake up like as what happened in lucid dreaming. So the mechanism is the same. It doesn't matter if it's happening in wakefulness, in between wakefulness and dreaming and falling asleep, or when you're fallen asleep and then you wake up in your dream. So this access is available. It's been practiced for many years. It's been mentioned with mystics like Sufi mystics. It's been mentioned with European mystics. It's been mentioned with like Egyptian traditions. So like dream incubation is exactly a way to, let's say, have conscious access to your unconscious dreaming. So I think dreaming as a word comes as very mundane word and practice for many people. But I think the distinction that I want to really make here is that yes, there is this phase that you fall asleep and you rest, and then you don't even remember anything the next day, and that you may refer to that as dreaming. But what we are really looking here is actually wakeful dreaming, which wakeful dreaming is when you consciously have access to your dream space, or to where you are unlimited, to your unlimited self. And beta carbolines, or these compounds coming from Syrian Ru, from bee copy. And I recently heard that people with iboga also, because iboga is also called an onerogen. An onerogen is actually anything that contributes to have onerophrenia. Onerophrenia is like this a state of, it's like dreaming or hallucination close to dreaming. So it has the same effect. And I think people will start to learn more about this after maybe this spike of interest about psychedelics start to flatten.
Mm-hmm. Let's talk a little bit about clinical benefit from dreaming. It sounds like there has been a pretty decent set of literature on this. Can you speak to that a little bit for us?
Yes. Well, dreaming as it comes, a lot of people after dreaming, they look into dream interpretation. So this is not what we're talking about. Let's say dreaming and dream interpretation as a way of understanding your dream. It has been around in many practices, but for a therapeutic use, the best way of looking into dream is actually a way that you can open up to the emotions of the dream. So because the emotions of the dream that communicate with you through the imagery, this is something that can open up a lot of information from your subconscious, basically information that you have processed and you don't remember in your life, or from the unconscious, like anything that you don't know that you don't know. It's totally like outside your control and comes from, like the larger or the higher existence somehow. So yeah, like there are like basically anything that cater to this methodology of either for example, like with dream yoga, like you're trying to understand, let's say this is counted, this is the Buddhist practice, dream yoga. Like this is a way of understanding like how you die, like you're getting ready for death. This is one way of, let's say, therapeutic use for anybody that's close to, let's say, the near death or like end of life, let's say, process end of life distress. That's exactly like what psilocybin, let's say, might do, for end of life distress as a, not pathology, but as a, let's say, for compassionate care. But for example, like another practice that I participated was actually coming through one of the practitioners I know from the Bay Area. And this is actually coming from an understanding of an Eastern understanding of dreaming. That's a deviation from Jungian practice by Henry Corbin. And so the methodology is called embodied imagination. And what it does is that, like, you basically just, like, whatever that you have dreamed, you take your dream into a session with your practitioner, and then you describe the dream with very detail. And then the practitioner puts you in this state between the hypnagogic states, in a state that, like, your eyes are closed, you try to imagine exactly your dream, and this time you have somebody walking with you in your dream, and then like kind of like looking into different imagery, and then what you're feeling about any of this imagery is what reflects as different let's say narratives that wants to speak to you, and then at the end you try to kind of combine and integrate all of them, because all these imageries are something that is talking to you. And this is not specifically about any dream, but these are some of the emotional dreams that you remember, and you kind of feel that it has a message for you. And it was very therapeutic for me, like it's so amazing to see that. Like this dream that I brought to the session, I think for me was maybe 5 seconds, and like the amount of lessons that it had for me, it was tremendous. So again, in terms of practice, I think it's definitely in parallel. In terms of like, it's not only therapeutic use, there's a lot of people actually using those for creativity, or let's say as an outlet for nurturing their creative process, or like using it as a creative portal. So for that, there's also many like the Salvatore Dali was using the state for his paintings, or Edison was actually using the steel ball with his micronap practice, and Edgar Allan Poe, was using this, like kind of again for inspiration for his stories. So there were many practices around the use of these states for creativity that's been documented.
Yeah, I love that there's that much documentation of the art there, and I do love that there is, in my mind, like a strong analogy between dream work and psychedelic states. One book, I think it was Eugene Gendlin, the really important book for me, Let Your Body Interpret Your Dreams, and it was about interpretation, because it's a little silly to suppose everybody has the same symbol sets installed. It's a big world. And, owl or dog probably mean very different things in different cultures. So letting people kind of understand what that means for them is probably the way to go. And I do love that people kind of just ran with that in the arts and kind of made a bunch of meaning out of that stuff. Are you, what kind of stuff are you seeing people use your products for right now? Are people doing similarly, like psychotherapeutic, self-exploration, artistic stuff? Is there other stuff that's not in those three
Yeah, it's
categories?
interesting. We just recently ran a big survey of like why people are using our compounds and like what is their archetypes. So the biggest archetype we actually kind of like landed on three different archetypes. That wisdom seeker is the highest number of our um, customers. But in terms of practice, basically the biggest portion of disciplines that they come to use them was from creative space, actually. Um,
Mm.
yeah, and then I think there are, because we are not as a supplement allowed to talk much about, let's say, many of these, uh, let's say, psychological pathologies. People that are really digging into using these for those applications, they are kind of like counted more as, I would say, biohackers, that they have done their own research to land on, let's say, a alternative medicine, and that's a little bit of a more research that somebody has to take on their side. And yeah, I think that the way that we started was mostly, well, we emerged from psychedelic space. So a lot of our customers actually know us from, the psychedelic space. That I think for them, again, this notion of something that is strong and potent and you feel it, this is still around. Like people, they want to, like, as this population grows, everybody has to have that kind of spiky experience before they get to something as something that they can bring onto their day-to-day life. But what we do is actually like something that you have to, you don't have a very strong experience. You're building something, as part of your lifestyle practice. And yeah, I think this is also for us a learning curve, that like what type of really customers are interested into establishing that. But interestingly, I would say that like many of our customers are plus 45 of age. So these are, yeah, people that they have done their experimentation, and I would say maybe, yeah, like kind of like landed on something that they know that this is kind of nurturing that side that they're looking for. Um,
That's interesting. I wonder about if there's, well, it is slightly less threatening, right? Like, you're going to dream. You just might dream a lot bigger and bolder. But like the psychedelic thing can be really scary. And there's also some like health concerns around psychedelics sometimes for some populations. So I wonder if there's some of that. That's interesting.
yeah, I would say the biggest impact of our compound, Joe, that I'm also trying to like use in our kind of communication language, because again, like we started from legacy, and then tap into science, and then also efficacy, and then a language of streaming. But um but necessarily, like what they do really is they're raising your awareness of the moment. This is what they do, like beta carbolines, that is their main effect. It's not necessarily kind of related to the dream. They are affecting on the dream cycles, because we have endogenous beta carbolines in our brain that actually is regulated. It actually helps the regulation of our REM cycles,
Mm.
and that is why it affects dreaming. But the impact that we are actually looking into from ancestral perspective is actually that awareness that you have when you are in these different states, and then when you are more open, let's say, to this dreamy state, that you have the flow of information from the other side. So like we may have all of these experiences on a daily basis, but when you are in that moment, let's say, of your deep meditation, or when you're, that higher awareness of the moment is actually what translate that and help that messaging to sits on something that your consciousness absorbs and then contributes to your understanding, and in service of, let's say, what you want to take from it. So it's not necessarily about dreaming. It's about, again, this mechanism of liminal state, that how you are in touch with the unconscious consciously. And dreaming is only one pathways of this, but this happens along the spectrum. It can happen totally in wakefulness. This is exactly the free imagination technique, that Jungian methodology, um, that can like be liminal dreaming, like exactly when you're waking up or when you're falling asleep, you have access to that level, and also maybe on the other side. But I would say the denominator of what they really do and contribute is like a very high sense of awareness about your conscious presence, and then be able to adopt that practice and wait for, let's say, the information that can support you for the purpose that you're after.
Yeah, I really appreciate that. That's cool. I do love the idea of getting the REM cycle kind of normalized, because we've been sort of abusing ourselves with all sorts of light for so long. Um, have you seen anything about any plants doing things to melatonin receptor sites, like in terms of like they're just not uptaking melatonin appropriately due to other molecules binding there, or anything that can refresh those?
Mm. Well, we you know that we have a supplement for deep sleep as well, and we kind of launched it as deep sleep because a big portion of the data that we collected was actually coming from brain waves, during sleep, as well as sleep tracking, and that actually opened up for us to really look into, let's say, the dream and dream cycles, and then how this regulation happens. Um, so interestingly, this is something maybe to share with your audience. Like last year, I was taking our sleep formulation for 50 days, consecutive days. And what happened to me was that we realized that it's not necessarily serving the deep sleep, because there's a lot of misinformation, or maybe the old information about, let's say, dream cycle, like that we don't dream in deep sleep. We dream in deep sleep as well. It's not only the REM sleep that we dream across all these stages of sleep. We just don't, like, their processes are different. But what the effect did to me was that it actually shortened basically my active sleep time, and then but my sleep cycles was more efficient. So I was feeling more rested neurologically, or let's say body. I can sleep, let's say, 4 hours and feel rested, but like the part that you psychologically feel rested, this is the part that can be totally optimized on a sleep cycle. So, and then when I was looking into, let's say, the cycle, like usually the cycles are like starts with like smaller cycle of REM, like when you fall asleep, and then gets more accumulated. And this accumulation that you get actually larger cycles of REM closer to the morning is actually because of the accumulation of beta carbolines in the brain. So that is why best lucid dreaming practices is advised to be, let's say, happening under our last REM, which people just put their alarm to wake up at, let's say, 4 a.m., 5 a.m., and then take it at that time. But I haven't really done my understanding from a few of the research that we have done is actually this transition, the biochemical transition of beta carbolines to melatonin, and then kind of on the other side, this is what regulates these sleep cycles. But as something that can, let's say, do what melatonin does, like in terms of like put you into sleep, it's not something that necessarily beta carbon doesn't help you with falling into sleep. They're helping your dream cycles to get regulated. So that's why it affects the sleep efficiency.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's really interesting. I love that. And there's so much talk right now of sleep in like the biohacking sector. There's even like a public awareness campaign going on in my town about light
Mm-hmm.
and how we need to be a little bit more careful. We have a super high suicide rate here where I live for some
Really
reason.
well.
I think it's altitude, maybe economics too, but like there's definitely some aspects to that. So we're having all sorts of interesting mental health interventions as a result, and light is one of them. So I will be experimenting with your products to see how I can get my sleep back together and hopefully get my dream life back. Honestly, it's been interesting to like not have it for so long, and I do wonder if it's primarily from cannabis.
Yeah.
Do you offhand know of anything about like cannabis impacting
Yeah.
dreams?
Yeah. Cannabis makes you not remember anything. And yeah, if you want to really have a dream practice, you should give up cannabis. And so I guess with cannabis, with uh, yeah, I'm not sure what exactly make. It's more about. It's not about dreaming. It's about the dream recall. So cannabis, they affect your memory in a way that you don't recall your dream. It's not that necessarily you don't remember, you don't dream, but because it affects the short-term memory recall. So what happens is that when you wake up, you don't basically everything would be gone. But versus, let's say, the dreaming practice with people journal is all about like when you wake up, immediately you write down, let's say, what you remember. So yeah, I would say if this is cannabis and dream recall, they don't go well together. If somebody wants to kind of like have information from kind of like psychological breakthroughs or anything that emotionally, let's say, is within and then you don't understand it, definitely cannabis as a plant medicine helps in other ways of processing emotionally, but for recollection from what you've processed internally or inside, I think that based on my own experience and people that I hear from, even they sleep, like some people, they take cannabis just to don't dream, or don't remember the dream, or to not have nightmares or to fall asleep easier. So it's a little bit different. The whole pathway is different from dreaming and dream recall, and then be able to really have agency in your dream.
Mm-hmm. That's interesting. I will have to cut back and do some experimentation. I think that's really interesting. Yeah, once in a while, I'm like, say I'm coming out of some sort of big inner work process, I will throw in a bunch of cannabis to like get more reasonable sleep that's not interrupted by wild dreams, because like the after effect of ayahuasca can be pretty robust, for instance, or even holotropic breath work. So that's one of my methods, but that's good info. And thanks for that. Cool. Well, I am kind of curious, like where do people buy? Is it purely off of your website right now, or are you in a few shops?
Well, yes, I guess our primary point of access to our products is our e-commerce platform, which is our website, and but we're also present in 2 stores currently. There is one in New York City in Soho, the Alchemist Kitchen. Most of New
Mm-hmm.
Yorkers, they know Alchemist Kitchen. And the second store is actually in West Hollywood. It's called Sean Leffer's, and they're also selling more of kind of like a niche supplements, and that's available. But other than that, people can order anywhere in the US from our website. We just recently also started shipping to Europe and some other regions, and that includes also custom clearance, which is the kind of like what most of people asking if this is something that's legal or non-scheduled. So our compliance team actually have done a great research in terms of like where these compounds are non-scheduled and are not on the list, and those are the countries that we have added to our shipment.
Great. Well, I love that. And any interest yet in Iran?
Well, yeah, I haven't really explored those space much. The reason for that is, I think even psychedelics, I know that there are things happening, let's say on Instagram, or kind of like more of a translation of what's happening, from the psychedelic realm, psychedelic psychotherapy as a therapeutic use of psychedelics. That I'm kind of indirectly contributing to that, but I also I remember that Rick Doblin was actually in Dubai last year, and he was interested to see if he can even expand like some of these trials to that region, including Iran. And yeah, I think there is what's really happening in the US, which was kind of an integration of the ecosystem, which includes, let's say, pharma, and includes biotech, let's say, founders and entrepreneurs and enthusiasts and psychotherapists. So it's kind of like an ecosystem. Creating that ecosystem, it's a lot of work. Interestingly, Iran, there is a lot of people doing, they're into psychotherapy and having a, let's say, counselor, and this is a very open space for people to deal with, let's say, their psychological issues. Like some countries, this is very it's like a stigma that you go and see a doctor, but in Iran, this is very well accepted. But it's still pharma, with all the antidepressants, runs the show there. So yeah, it's kind of like a bigger game that I guess culturally I haven't really looked into that, because that can cost, that can be very costly for me, like trying to get something mystical to the surface. So yeah, not necessarily. I haven't really explored that
Right.
in Iran.
Well, that's super interesting to know that that's happening, and it's a lot more traditional than we might have expected in terms of like psychotherapeutic practice. That's great. Well, anything we missed, Shaheen, that you want to make sure we include?
Um, I think we kind of covered. I think the biggest topic that I wanted to really share here is that beta carbolines are not only MAOIs, and MAOI is just like a tip of the iceberg for these compounds. And narrative-wise, something that has been tracked on the side beside DMT, but beta carbolines by themselves, they are very psychoactive, and yeah, they have been the main compound in multiple of the traditional psychoactive and psychedelic brews that they really need their own attention and discovery. And it's not necessarily related to dream, is again opening up to kind of the space between falling asleep and dreaming, which we are referring to as hypnagogic states or hypnagogia. And I think this is, as we know, there's so much research going on with very frontier companies about lucid dreaming or about hypnagogia. This is kind of like might be come as something that is in parallel, but these are all the same thing. I think this is maybe a message that I would love to leave at this with this podcast.
Yeah, cool. Well, Shaheen, thank you so much for being here. I hope we can do some things in the future. I love this kind of this idea of using dreams skillfully, and using some supplements to make sure we're having the right effect is really great. And I love the kind of revival from traditional roots of something that's been so quiet for so long. So nice work, and thank you for your efforts, and wish you all the success in the world. And let's cut here, and we can chat backstage for a minute.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me, Joe. I appreciate it.
Absolutely.